Aloha champions, and welcome back. Mr. Chambers here, and today I'm going to be reading 2 more chapters from Powerless. Thank you for all of your responses so far. Thank you for paying attention to something that I don't even teach. I know it's not math, I know it's not science, but I am enjoying having a chance to read out one of my favorite stories. For today's activity, before I get into reading chapter 10 and 11. I know this is backwards, I'll fix it. Powerless chapters 10 and 11. As a detective, what kind of clues would you look for to help out the supers who are afraid of losing their powers? And at the end of this, we'll meet the artist of the Johnny Noble comic books. It's upside down. I want you to draw a picture of Johnny Noble fighting the Shroud. Okay? So, 2 things for you to do. Quick list of questions. What kind of clues should you be looking for if you're trying to help the supers hold on to their powers? And B, draw a picture of Johnny Noble fighting the Shroud. With that being said, it's on to reading Powerless by Matthew Cody. Chapter 10. Welcome, guests. Daniel, you've got some visitors here to see you. Are you feeling up to it, kiddo? Yeah, of course. I keep telling you, Dad. I'm fine. Well, if you don't mind, I'll let the doctors make that diagnosis around here. Frankly, Daniel felt anything but fine. His right arm was throbbing with a dull ache that turned into stabbing pain every time he moved it. And there was an itch halfway up his cast that was unreachable. At least the nausea was gone. This morning was the first time that he'd been able to keep down a solid breakfast. How did it make it taste any better, though? Hospital food was still hospital food. Daniel heard someone cough and was surprised to see Rohan and Louisa standing in the doorway. When his dad had announced that he had his first visitors, he just assumed that Molly would be among them. "Hey," said Rohan. He was carrying a package under his arm wrapped with metallic blue paper. "Hey," Daniel said. "Well," said Daniel's dad, grabbing his coat, "I'm going to go out and stretch my legs for a minute and let you kids catch up." No arm wrestling. The kids waited for Daniel's father to close the door behind him. Then Louisa sat down gently on the bed next to Daniel. "Does it hurt?" she asked, eyeing the cast. "A bit," answered Daniel, "but I have had worse." Daniel caught Rohan rolling his eyes, and Daniel felt himself blush. He had had worse. He'd never so much as broken a finger before now. He didn't know why he was showing off in front of Louisa. "I brought you some chocolates from the gift shop," she said. "I figured you'd be sick of the hospital food. All they had were the ones in the heart-shaped boxes, though." "Thanks," said Daniel. "Okay," said Rohan. "So, Daniel, what's the prognosis? Do you get to keep missing school, or are they finally kicking you out of here?" "I'm leaving today or tomorrow, but I probably won't be back in school for another week." "That's terrible," moaned Louisa. "We all miss you around the treehouse." "Oh, I almost forgot," she said, reaching into her coat pocket. "Rose wanted me to give you this." She handed Daniel a crayon drawing of a boy, at least Daniel assumed it was supposed to be a boy, falling on his head. There was a happy yellow sun watching in the sky. Daniel laughed. "Tell her thanks for me, Louisa, and tell her I plan on getting it framed." "Do you need anything, Daniel?" she asked. Do you need an extra pillow or anything? Daniel thought for a moment. Well, I could go for a soda, if you don't mind. Daniel thought Louisa practically left out her shoes. Sure! Is there a vending machine nearby? Rohan interjected before Daniel could answer. Nope. You have to go all the way down to the cafeteria. All the way to the ground floor. Oh, okay, said Louisa, blinking. I'll be back in a few minutes, then. She smiled at Daniel. Don't go anywhere. Daniel gestured to his broken arm and smiled back. I won't. Rohan waited until Louisa was out of earshot. Then he turned back to Daniel. I think I've discovered your superpower, Daniel. Oh, yeah? You have the power to make Louisa swoon. It's kind of gross, actually. Me, but seriously, laughed Rohan. Have you noticed the way that she looks at you? You don't need super senses to see it. Daniel rolled his eyes, but the truth was he had noticed. He just wasn't sure what he was supposed to think about it. Has Molly said anything about her? Rohan adjusted his glasses and squinted at Daniel. Molly? No. Why? No reason, answered Daniel quickly. It's just, I never hear the end of it. The two were silent for a moment before Daniel spoke up, more quietly this time. How's Simon? He's fine, answered Rohan. Physically, he wasn't hurt at all. That's a relief, but does he... It's just like all the others now. A normal 13-year-old boy. Daniel's head sank back into his pillow. He caught the emphasis in Rohan's voice and understood immediately. So it had all been for nothing. Daniel had hoped that he had gotten to him in time, that he had stopped or at least interrupted whatever it was that thing that was trying to do. It would be hard to face Simon again, even though Daniel knew that he would have no memory of what had been done to him. But Daniel would know. He would never forget. So, you broke your arm, huh? Rohan pulled a chair up next to his bed and began studying the control panel of buttons that Daniel used to raise and lower the hospital bed. Yeah, and I had a pretty bad concussion. But I'm out of the woods, and I'm hoping to go home today. This place is dead boring. Here, I brought you something. It might help pass the time. Rohan set the blue package on Daniel's lap. Daniel fumbled at the wrapper with his left hand, but he couldn't get the right leverage to tear the paper. It just kept sliding around on the sheets. Oh, sorry, here. Let me. Rohan tore the paper off with a flourish and revealed a stack of Johnny Noble comics, each one bagged and boarded for extra protection. Wow. Are you sure? Absolutely. Just don't get any pudding on them. This is strictly a super's loan. Since you can't go to the tree fort, I'm bringing the tree fort to you. Thanks, Rohan. Don't mention it. Rohan gestured to the panel next to the bed. So, what do these buttons do? Don't touch them. Some move the bed up and down, and one of them calls the nurse. It took me like an hour to find the perfect position for this bed, so hands off. Is your nurse pretty? My nurse's name is Ralph. Oh, so no. No, Daniel smiled in spite of himself, and Rohan looked pleased with his little joke. Things were suddenly easier between the two of them. So, have you talked to Molly? Asked Daniel. Talk? No, not so much. Dodged, yes. At the bus stop, she pretends I'm not even there, which was kind of a relief at first. At least she's no longer taking swings at me, but now it's getting old. Daniel, Rohan went on, turning serious. You know why I did it, right? Why I stopped her from helping? Daniel nodded. Rohan continued. She wouldn't have been able to help you. She would have ended up just like Simon. Yeah, I know. Molly knows too. That's probably why she's so mad at you right now. She hates it when other people are right. If it's any consolation, she gave me one heck of a black eye for my trouble. Rohan took off his glasses and Daniel could see the faint outline of yellow and blue bruise under Rohan's left eye. You should have seen it a week ago. I look like a prize fighter. A prize fighter who gets beaten by girls, Daniel teased. Well, yes, but mean girls. Very mean. Speaking of trouble, is Eric mad? About what? As far as he knows, you were camping out with Molly and me and you climbed the wrong tree. You mean, you lied to him? I am withholding certain details of the truth until I get all the facts. There's no need to upset him until we know exactly what happened. And I was hoping you could tell me that. What happened at Simon's window? What did you see, Daniel? And so Daniel recounted what he saw in Simon's bedroom that night. The darkness, the shadow that moved. Daniel was surprised at how hard it was to say it out loud for the first time, but he immediately felt better for having done it. Through it all, Rohan listened attentively, never interrupting, but Daniel did see his eyes go wide several times. It was affecting him too. Rohan was always so calm, so unflappable. He was afraid. I actually wondered if you saw anything with your powers. I thought you might have. Rohan shook his head. Trees were in the way. I can't see through things, you know. Plus, I was kind of busy getting punched in the face. Rohan got up from his seat and started pacing the room. Proof. 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 We need proof, he said. For what? To convince Eric that what you saw wasn't simply your own shadow on the wall. That your mind wasn't playing tricks on you. Because I'm telling you, it will take some hard and fast evidence to make Eric take this seriously. Well, what about the camera? I was taking pictures the whole time. But Rohan was shaking his head again. Yeah, well, you found it. Rohan reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of photographs. They were all the same. Massive shadows and blurred images. Whatever that thing was in Simon's room, it wasn't easily captured on camera. Daniel's hopes sank. It seemed that everything he'd done that night had been a waste of time. Rohan, I thought you were with Eric on all this. Obey the rules and all, except what fate has in store for you, remember? Rohan looked at his friend. I listened to you, and I could tell you're telling the truth, Daniel. And to be honest, what you saw scares me. But maybe it was destiny that sent you to Noble's Green. So maybe it's our destiny to stop this, whatever it is, from ruining another kid's life. Rohan smiled a wicked smile. Maybe it's our destiny to kick some butt. Daniel laughed. Just when he thought he had his friend figured out, Rohan managed to surprise him. But we are going to need Eric. Rohan was serious again. And like I said, for that we need some real evidence. Daniel tried to kick away the sheets in frustration, but as he did so, the stack of Johnny Noble comics began to slide off his lap and onto the floor. He reached over to stop them, but all he managed was to bump his cast against the bed rail. He winced as a jolt of pain went up his arm. This was going to take some getting used to. Here, let me get those, offered Rohan. Thanks, said Daniel, gesturing weakly with his broken wing. Guess I'm not going to be much use for a while. Not so fast. If we're going to convince Eric before his birthday, then we are going to need you to do what you do best. Which is? You're a detective, aren't you? Said Rohan, handing the books back to him. Time to do some detecting. Which brings us back to our first question. As a detective, what clues would you look for to help out the supers? Pause. Chapter 11. Written and drawn by Herman Plunkett. The day after Daniel came home from the hospital, Graham went in. Graham's last chemo treatment had been especially strong, and she was now suffering from what his father described as a sluggish immune system, which meant that she was so weak that even a common cold could be dangerous. The doctors moved her to a special wing of the hospital where no visitors under 14 were allowed until she got stronger. Daniel and Georgie wouldn't be able to visit her. But their mom went to the hospital every day, and their father visited every evening. Daniel had missed her terribly. With Graham gone and his parents spending so much time up at the hospital, the old house seemed emptier, lonelier. His parents were obviously exhausted, though they tried not to show it. And seeing how tired they were, how much pressure the two of them were under, it was hard not to feel guilty about hurting himself. His parents thought that he had broken his arm in a stargazing accident. He told them he had leaned too far out of Simon's window and had lost his balance. He felt bad about lying, but there was no way to tell them the truth without putting the supers in danger. Not that his parents would have believed him anyway. They had enough to worry about with Graham. They didn't need Daniel's crazy heroics adding to their stress. So Daniel found himself with time on his hands. The doctors had told him to stay home from school for another week. In that time, Georgie discovered a new favorite word, and that word was no. His brother waddled around the house, wielding the word like a weapon. Georgie, time to eat. No. Georgie, time for bed. No. Georgie, let go of my hair. No. Sometimes the only way to escape was to get out of the house. But since he wasn't allowed yet to go for walks, doctor's orders, he spent many an evening pacing the long wrap-around porch out front. One evening he was just making his fifth turn when he saw Louisa biking up his driveway. She waved and Daniel waved back. He was happy to have some company, but he couldn't help but remember what Rohan had said about her. And Daniel swore that if she ever swooned in front of him, he'd die. Plus, he still hadn't seen hide nor hair of Molly, even though she lived right across the street. But if he were to be perfectly honest with himself, there was something about Louisa that Daniel liked. Something very, well, girl-like. "How are you feeling?" she asked, as she sat down on the porch swing. She smoothed out her skirt, scooted over, leaving plenty of room for someone to join her. But not so much room that they'd be all far apart. Molly would have thrown her feet up and taken the whole swing. Daniel decided to remain standing. "I'm a lot better. The doctor says that I can go back to school on Monday, so I guess that's a good thing." "I wrote out all the notes for science class for you," she said, reaching into her backpack. "We're studying genetics and the Human Genome Project this week." She handed Daniel a sheaf of neatly written notes, complete with color-coded highlights. "Wow," said Daniel. "You didn't have to do all that. I could have gotten them from Rohan when I got back." "Well, I didn't want you to fall behind. And it's interesting stuff. Mapping human DNA. Mr. Snyder said that it's like a big scientific puzzle. A mystery. And I know how much you like mysteries." "Yeah, I do. Well, thanks, Louisa. These are great. Really, this is, sweet of you." Louisa blushed prettily at the compliment. It was funny. Whenever Molly blushed, her face got all splotchy red as if she was getting ready to break out in hives or something. Plus, the only times that Daniel had seen Molly blush had been when she was angry. With her, compliments usually got you a punch in the arm. And yet Daniel found himself glancing across the street at Molly Lee's little yellow house. Louisa folded her hands in her lap and began to gently swing herself on the porch swing. "Simon's back at school," she said. "Yeah, Rohan told me. You know, I was a little surprised when I heard that you'd been staying with him. With it all happened, I mean." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Their story had been that he, Rohan, and Molly had been camping out the night of Daniel's accident. They hadn't mentioned Simon at all. I was camping in the woods with Rohan and Molly." Louisa kept swinging on the swing. "Yeah, I know that's what you guys said. But I overheard you and Rohan at the hospital. Turned out there was a soda machine just down the hallway from the room after all." Now it was Daniel's turn to blush. She'd heard everything, or at least enough to guess what had really gone on the night of Simon's birthday. If she told Eric now, before they'd had a chance to solve the mystery, they would all be in a load of trouble. He needed to convince Louisa to keep their secret. He needed to talk fast. "Louisa, she looked at him and smiled. "Don't worry, Daniel. I'm not a snitch." Embarrassed, Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. "I think I'll sit down now." He plopped down next to her and absently picked at his cast. "How much of it did you hear?" "Not much, but enough to know you guys are trying to stop it. Whatever it is." "Well, we tried, but we failed. I mean, look at Simon. It's just awful." "Is it? Is it really, Daniel?" Daniel looked at Louisa, then blinking. They had stopped swinging. "What do you mean? Of course it is. I mean, I don't even have any powers. But just the thought of losing them?" "That's right, Daniel. You don't have any powers. You don't know what it's like to be different, to be a freak. Look, I know that Molly and Eric and even Rose, they love having powers. They feel like it makes us special, unique. But what if I don't want to be special? What if I don't want to change the world? I just want to grow up, have friends, go to movies, and maybe even kiss a boy." Gone were the coy looks, the smiles. Louisa was serious now, more serious than Daniel had ever seen her before. "When you first joined us, Daniel, I was so happy. I am so happy just to be around you. Because for the first time in my life, I can forget what I am. I could just be a girl." But Louisa, what I saw that night at Simon's, it wasn't right. What happened to him, it wasn't natural. Something is doing this to you. And I know deep in my gut that it's wrong. Are you sure, Daniel? Are you really sure? Because what if you're wrong? What if the rules are right and you guys are making a huge mistake that could be putting all of us in danger? Daniel had no answer. He hadn't actually seen that thing in Simon's room do anything to Simon, but he had felt it. Lisa got up from the porch swing. Just be sure, Daniel. That's all I ask. You guys are my best friends, and I'll always be on your side. But just be sure. Lisa grabbed her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, smiling at Daniel again. Anyway, I hope those notes are useful. Get better soon, okay? Then she turned and walked back to her bike. She gave a small wave and pedaled away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts, which were more confused than ever. Back in his room, Daniel pored once more over the issues of Fantastic Futures starring Johnny Noble. If there was a clue in there, he needed to find it now more than ever. Daniel was convinced that Louisa was wrong about what had happened to Simon, but she was right about one thing. He needed proof. It was irresponsible for him to act without it. The pages were fragile, and Daniel had to be all the more careful since he couldn't use his broken arm. Eventually, he found a comfortable position at his desk, with a comic spread out before him and his cast propped up on a stack of books. The dull ache that had bothered him so much in the hospital was gone, only to be replaced by a constant tickle. Most of the time, he could slide a pencil into the cast to scratch, but every now and then that tickle would creep just beyond the reach of even the pencil. And in those moments, Daniel felt like smashing his head into a wall. One thing Daniel noticed about rereading the stack of books was that this was not a complete set. There was a gap in the middle where the issues jumped from numbers 76 to 79. 2 comics were missing from the collection. Still, the rest of the books were obviously collector's items, and that was only part of their value. These stories were the closest thing that the Supers had to a history, and Rohan had showed a lot of faith in their friendship by trusting Daniel with them. And though he couldn't quite believe that the Supers were the legacy of some comic book hero, Daniel wondered if there was another connection here that they were all overlooking. He flipped open one of the books and studied the publishing credits on the first page. According to these, the comic came out in January of 1946. So long ago. Written and drawn by Herman Plunkett. What a funny name, thought Daniel. He tried to picture Mr. Plunkett, a grown man sitting at his drawing table, creating stories out of the life of Jonathan Noble. What imagination this guy must have had. But on a whim, Daniel went online, typed in a name search. What he found was archived newspaper article just a few months old from the Noble Herald. And the headline read, Plunkett Philanthropies Donates New University Library. Dedication ceremony chaired by resident Herman Plunkett himself. Resident Herman Plunkett. Could it be the same man? That would mean that he was A, still alive, and B, living right here in Noble's Green. Daniel decided to do a name and address search, and sure enough, there was an H. Plunkett on Cedar Lane. The man who created Johnny Noble had been living here in town all this time, and none of the Supers knew? Cedar Lane was not far from Elm, and it took Daniel all of 10 minutes to make the bike ride. Even favoring his bad arm, if he made good time, he hoped he could be there and back before his dad returned Georgie from daycare. What was surprising was that Cedar turned out to be a private lane, with only a long, large house at the end of the street. Actually, house was an understatement. If there was a single mansion in Noble's Green, this was it. Tall pillars of white marble lined the broad entranceway of the immaculately kept front garden. A white, old-fashioned arched roof peeked over the trees. Herman Plunkett had obviously done very well for himself. As Daniel walked up the winding garden path to the front door, he played a little game with himself. He tried to guess what Herman Plunkett, the creator of Johnny Noble, might look like. Would he have a kindly face? Bug-eyed spectacles hanging from the bridge of his nose? Maybe a big, bold pipe like the one Sherlock Holmes would have smoked. Maybe he was still writing and drawing, and Daniel would find him hunched over his draftsman table, sketching away. As he approached the pathway's end, Daniel noticed a well-dressed older gentleman standing a few feet away reading the paper. This man wore an expensive suit and had a neat white beard. He smiled as Daniel approached. "Excuse me," said Daniel. "I'm here to see Mr. Plunkett." "Oh, I think you'll find him inside. Just ring the bell and tell his nurse you're here to see him." "Oh, thanks," said Daniel. "Not a problem, son," the man said with a smile and went back to his paper. Daniel wondered what this man's job might be, standing out here all alone. Security, maybe? He was a big guy, if a bit on the old side. Daniel rang the front bell, and after a minute or so, a woman's plump face appeared at the door. Hi, my name's Daniel Corrigan, and I was wondering if I could speak to Mr. Plunkett. See, I'm a big fan of his work, and I was hoping to get his autograph." "Mr. Plunkett's work?" the fat nurse scoffed. "You're a fan of a businessman, are you?" No, his comic books. See, I have a bunch of comics that Mr. Plunkett drew a long time ago." He opened his backpack and showed her the contents with his arm in a sling. It was a struggle to do that much. "Comic books, huh?" she asked, peering into the bag. "Well, I wouldn't know anything about that. Mr. Plunkett was a very well-regarded businessman in his days. But he is long retired now, and you really should try reading real books. You know, those things will rot your brain." Daniel sighed. This woman was a real pain. He looked over his shoulder to see if he might get some assistance from the well-dressed gentleman, but that man was gone. "Hold on," said the nurse, looking him up and down. "I'll go see if he's awake." Awake? Thought Daniel. It's only 4 in the afternoon. Just how old is this guy? The nurse returned after a few long minutes. "Mr. Plunkett will see you. But you don't have any sweets on you, do you? Mr. Plunkett has a strict diet and can't have any sweets." No, I don't have any candy." She glanced at his backpack. "You sure? Little boys are always carrying around chocolate bars or licorice drops." "Licorice drops?" Nothing, I promise. Can I please go see Mr. Plunkett now?" "Fine. Go on. He is in the reading room. This way. But don't let him bribe you into sneaking him in any treats. He knows better." The reading room turned out to be a small annex off the main building, and through the large glass doors were rows and rows of books, newspapers, and magazines. Several comfortable overstuffed chairs dotted the room, each equipped with its own reading lamp. In the chair closest to the window sat a shriveled little man, wearing an old sweater and bulky glasses. He was so small that his feet barely touched the floor, and his face was buried in an old paperback. But despite the thick glasses, he had the book pressed so close to his face that it almost touched his nose. On the book's cover was an illustration of a spaceman jetpacking toward an exploding rocket. This had to be Herman Plunkett. As Daniel opened the door, Plunkett's head popped up from behind his book, his beady eyes peering over the edge of his glasses. "Hey, who's there?" The old man was sheepishly skittish, like a turtle ready to pop back into his shell. "Excuse me, sir, but are you Herman Plunkett?" "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Corrigan. I think your nurse told you I was here?" "Oh, the boy with the comic books." "Yes, sir," said Daniel. Plunkett slid down out of his chair and began cleaning up a stack of newspapers off a nearby footstool. He shuffled the pile of papers onto a coffee table that already weighted down with heaps of old encyclopedias and other reference books. "Here you are, then," he said, patting the seat on the footstool. Daniel let the reading room door close behind him and sat down, his backpack held tightly in his good arm. Plunkett hopped back into his chair and folded his hands neatly into his lap. "So, young man, fancy yourself a comic book aficionado, eh?" "You bet," Daniel lied. "Actually, Mr. Plunkett, I'm really more interested in the classics. I'm a Golden Age fan." "You don't say. Funny to find a boy your age who gives a darn about such things. Most youngsters these days are too interested in the video games, full of explosions and the like. No time for real stories." Plunkett leaned in close and winked conspiratorially. "Say, you don't happen to have any sweets in that little backpack of yours, do you? Maybe a licorice drop or two?" "No, sir, I'm sorry." Shame. I sure could go for a licorice drop." Daniel smiled uncomfortably at the old man and then looked around at the reading room that Herman Plunkett had constructed for himself. The stack seemed to be made up almost entirely of old pulp novels and hardback adventure anthologies from the 19th and early 20th centuries. All of them were in mint condition. It was like walking into a library out of time. This Plunkett fellow was a man who had found his niche, and he stuck with it. One book in particular caught Daniel's eye. A brown, leather-bound volume propped up alone on a side shelf. Although the gold lettering of the title was faded, Daniel could still make out the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. "Sherlock Holmes, the final problem," said Plunkett, noticing Daniel's interest. "Are you a Sherlockian, young man?" Oh, what?" Daniel asked. "A Sherlockian, a devotee of the world's greatest detective." Daniel thought about it. He had never heard the term before, but he liked the sound of it. "Yeah, I guess so, but I haven't read that one. It looks pretty old." Plunkett hopped down from his chair and grabbed the volume off its shelf. For a little old man, he was surprisingly spry. The Final Problem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, first published in 1893, said Plunkett, dusting off the spine. "This here is a later edition, but still quite valuable. One of the few books in my library not meant for reading. The death of Sherlock Holmes. Careful with it now. Plunkett handed the book to Daniel, who set it down gently on an empty table. It was too hard to hold with only one good arm. He carefully lifted the cover and reverently flipped through the first few pages. On the title page was an illustration of two men wrestling on a bridge, overlooking an ominous waterfall. It's a drawing of Holmes fighting his arch-enemy, Professor Moriarty, at Reichenbach Falls, Plunkett explained. Their fighting pushes them both over the edge, and they tumble over the falls to the shared doom. A grand death. Very dramatic. Of course, Doyle brought him back eventually, Plunkett said with a smile. No one stays dead for long in adventure stories. Daniel studied the illustration in detail, the ominous scenery, the expressions of desperation on the faces of the two men. Daniel found it upsetting, really, looking at the moment before the death of his hero. It took him a minute or so to find the artist's signature. There, hidden in a fine pencil work of the rushing waterfall, were the initials H.P. You drew this? Daniel asked. I did! Back when I was a young freelancer. Back then I'd accept any hack job with a paycheck. But that one I'd have done for free. That was a labor of love. Daniel closed the book and reached inside his backpack. He pulled out the bundle of plastic bagged comics and set them in front of Mr. Plunkett. Did you also draw these? Plunkett squinted behind his thick glasses and held one of the comics up to his nose. Daniel watched as he wrinkled his face, spread into a wide grin. Well, what do you know? He said, thumbing through the other issues. Hello there, Johnny. Plunkett settled back into his chair with great gentleness, and he began to turn the pages. He was drinking in every panel and every page. I haven't seen one of these in good condition in, well, I can't tell you, it's been so long. Where do you get them? A friend gave them to me. They were passed down in his family. Must be some friend. He know these babies are worth a pretty penny. Yeah, but we're not interested in selling them. Good boy. Wow, well, you look at how well the color held up, you know. I still have the pencils to some of these, but I haven't seen one printed in color in a long time. Long time. Daniel had obviously gotten on Plunkett's good side with the revelation of a nearly full run of comic books written and drawn by Herman Plunkett. Right now, Plunkett was busy basking in the glow of his own fandom. Daniel didn't let that moment pass. So is it true that you wrote them all yourself? And you did the art? It is. I was a young man when I did these, still chasing the dream of being a real artist. That was before I gave it all up and got a real job. I was always good at drawing and numbers, but there's a lot more money in numbers, as you can see. Plunkett gestured to the luxurious surroundings, and Daniel nodded appreciatively. Daniel wasn't sure exactly what numbers he was referring to, but they obviously paid well. But this, said Plunkett, his attention back on the comics, well, this was my passion. I was working on Fantastic Futures back when I was just a science fiction magazine. Then the world went crazy for superheroes and we started using Johnny as our lead story. Unfortunately, by the time we got rolling, the market had started to fill up. It's amazing that that book lasted as long as it did, really. How do you come up with the character? I mean, was he based on anyone? Daniel hesitated, unsure whether to warm up the old guy some more or plunge right on in. Plunkett gave Daniel a sideways look and sucked on his teeth. I know what you're driving at. You think I stole Johnny from the folk stories. Threw a mask on him and called him mine, don't you? Daniel opened his mouth to come up with an excuse, but nothing came out. Unexpectedly, Plunkett just laughed. Guilty as charged, but you got to understand that it was just what folks did back then. Comics became a big business practically overnight, and there was a craziness to get in on all of that action. And being that I was from here in Noble's Green, I felt that I had some right to tell stories about him. Daniel nodded, so it was true. Johnny Noble was just a stolen legend. The money-making scheme of a desperate young artist. The comics weren't the true-life accounts of a secret hero or the hidden clues to a mystery of a small group of super children. Daniel's only lead had just hit a dead end. Plunkett must have mistaken Daniel's obvious trajectory for something else, because he reached up to the same shelf that the Sherlock Holmes book had rested on and brought down a dusty old folder. Tell you what, son, since you came all this way, and since I'm impressed that anyone even remembers Johnny Noble in this day and age, I'm going to give you a present. He used the sleeve of his sweater to dust off the portfolio and handed it to Daniel. Inside were original penciled pages from Fantastic Futures starring Johnny Noble. There was no ink or color, and the dialogue was missing in places, but Plunkett's original pencil drawings were still breathtaking. His talent was undeniable. Even back then, this was quite a treasure, and even though Daniel didn't find the answers he was looking for, this gift still touched him. Thank you, he said. And he meant it. Now, if I see those popping up for sale on the internet of yours, I'll be mighty disappointed, said Plunkett, wagging his finger. Oh, they won't, I promise. All right, then. You better run along now. It's past my nap time, and old Nurse Hardbutt out there gets mean when I miss my nap. But I'm glad you came by, my boy. You gave an old man a nice walk down memory lane. And remember, enjoy those sketches. Those are one of a kind. Back in his room, Daniel lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling, depressed. The trip to Plunkett's house had been a failure, and Daniel would have to report back to Rohan that all of his detecting had turned up nothing more than some cool sketches. And he had to admit, he was stumped. After a time, the boredom finally got to Daniel, and he went to his desk and opened Plunkett's portfolio. As he flipped through the pages of Johnny in action, he comforted himself with the knowledge that Eric, at least, would love this stuff. Here were the original drawings of Johnny lifting tanks, dodging bullets in midair, and fighting for honesty and decency. Eric would treasure them, at least for the few weeks that he had left to be a kid. He was about a third of the way through the sketches when he saw it, the cover illustration of issue number 77. Heart pounding, hand shaking, he went to his backpack and searched through his stack of comics 74, 75, 76. Daniel went back and he looked again at the cover of issue 77, the first of the missing magazines, laid out before him. The cover featured a nighttime scene, a sleeping boy next to an open window. Outside the window, Johnny Noble was swooping down out of the sky. In the room, reaching for the boy's sleeping form, was a shadow that Daniel had seen before, a shadow with a heart of fire. The banner across the top of the page read, Introducing Johnny Noble's trusty new sidekick and his diabolical arch-enemy. Both in this one fantastic issue. But will Johnny be too late to save his new friend from the terrible hands of the Shroud? The Shroud. Breathless, Daniel sat back in his chair. Their enemy now had a name. Thank you for tuning in for another reading of Powerless by Matthew Cody. That was chapters 10 and 11. As a reminder, 2 things that I'd like for you to do for that extra credit that you are working for. Number 1, as a detective, what kind of clues do you think you need to be searching for to try to help the supers figure out their problems about possibly losing their powers? Give me 5 different clues, 5 different things that you don't think Daniel has seen yet. Questions that you might want to ask. Clues you might want to uncover. Part B, draw a picture of Johnny Noble, superhero of Noble's Green, and have him fight the Shroud, that dark, shadowy figure we saw in Simon's room. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a pleasure for me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.